What kind of horror could hide for years behind the quiet streets of a small farming town without anyone realizing what was happening? In May of 1999, police officers entered an abandoned bank building in the tiny rural town of Snowtown, South Australia. The structure had long been forgotten, its dusty interior silent except for the echo of footsteps and the faint metallic smell of old vault doors. Investigators were not expecting to find anything extraordinary. They were simply following a lead connected to a missing persons investigation. But when the officers opened the old bank vault, they were confronted with something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Inside the vault were several large industrial barrels, sealed and stacked in the darkness. At first glance, they looked ordinary, perhaps old storage containers left behind by previous occupants. But as investigators pried one open, a powerful, sickening odor filled the air. What they discovered inside would soon become one of the most infamous crime scenes in Australian history. The barrels contained human remains. What began as a routine search quickly transformed into a national nightmare. As forensic teams examined the barrels more closely, it became clear that this was not the result of a single crime. The evidence pointed to something far more disturbing, a prolonged series of killings that had remained hidden for years. Eventually, investigators would link the barrels to the deaths of at least 12 people. And yet, the strangest part of the story was this: almost none of the victims had been killed in Snowtown. The town itself, a quiet agricultural community about 140 kilometers north of Adelaide, had fewer than 1,000 residents. Known for its grain silos and open farmland, Snowtown was a kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and neighbors knew each other by name. For decades it had been peaceful, unremarkable, almost invisible to the outside world. Now it would become permanently associated with one of the most disturbing criminal cases the country had ever seen. The victims whose lives were eventually tied to the case came from different backgrounds, but many shared one tragic similarity. They were vulnerable people living on the margins of society. Some struggled with mental health challenges. Others lived with disabilities. Some were simply individuals who had fallen on hard times, drifting through unstable living situations or relying on government assistance to survive. To their families and friends, however, they were far more than statistics. They were sons, daughters, siblings, and friends. Many of them were described by those who knew them as kind-hearted people who simply wanted to live peaceful lives. Some were known for their generosity and willingness to help others. Others were remembered for their humor or their quiet personalities. In many cases, when these individuals disappeared, their absence did not immediately trigger large-scale investigations. Some had complicated personal lives, and it was not uncommon for them to move frequently or lose contact with relatives. That tragic reality allowed something terrible to unfold over the course of several years. Between 1992 and 1999, a group of men carried out a series of killings that would remain hidden for nearly a decade. At the center of it all was a man whose influence over others would prove devastating. As investigators began to piece together the identities of the victims and trace their final days, a single name surfaced again and again: John Justin Bunting. To those who barely knew him, Bunting could appear ordinary, just another man living in the working-class suburbs around Adelaide. But to people who spent time with him, he was something far more complex. He possessed an unusual ability to dominate conversations and influence those around him. Some described him as charming, even persuasive. Others said there was always something unsettling beneath the surface. Bunting had strong, extreme beliefs about morality and justice. He frequently spoke about people he believed were corrupt or dangerous, accusing them of terrible acts without clear proof. Over time, those accusations became a central part of his identity. He began presenting himself as someone who could expose and punish individuals he considered dirty or immoral. He formed close relationships with several younger men who looked up to him. Through long conversations, shared frustrations, and constant reinforcement of his beliefs, he slowly drew them into his worldview. What began as talk about justice and punishment eventually evolved into something far more dangerous. One of the most disturbing elements investigators later uncovered was what became known as Bunting's spider wall. Inside one of the homes connected to the group, Bunting had reportedly created a display listing names of people he believed deserved punishment. The wall included notes, accusations, and references to individuals he suspected of wrongdoing. To Bunting, this list represented enemies, people he believed society had failed to hold accountable. But to detectives who later studied it, the wall revealed something deeply troubling, a fixation with targeting specific individuals, many of whom were vulnerable or socially isolated. Bunting's influence over others appeared to grow stronger over time. People who spent long periods around him often began adopting his beliefs. Conversations about morality and justice slowly blurred into discussions about confronting or punishing those he accused. This environment created a dangerous dynamic. Experts who analyzed the case believe Bunting used a combination of persuasion, intimidation, and psychological pressure to maintain control over the people closest to him. Some individuals within his circle reportedly feared challenging him. Others seemed to view him almost as a leader whose ideas should be followed. That influence would soon draw several men into a series of crimes that would span nearly 7 years. Among them were 3 individuals who would become central figures in the investigation: Robert Joe Wagner, James Vlassakis, and Mark Haydon. Each of them had different relationships with Bunting, but all would eventually become entangled in the events that led to the Snowtown Murders. Robert Wagner was perhaps the closest to Bunting. The two shared many of the same extreme views, and investigators later concluded that Wagner became deeply involved in the violence that followed. James Vlassakis was much younger. As Bunting's stepson, he grew up within Bunting's sphere of influence. Over time, he too became drawn into the group's activities, eventually playing a role in several of the crimes. Mark Haydon's involvement was somewhat different. While he was not believed to have participated in the killings themselves, investigators later determined that he helped conceal evidence and assisted in hiding the bodies. Together, these individuals formed the inner circle surrounding John Bunting. To outsiders, they appeared to be a group of friends or acquaintances spending time together in suburban neighborhoods. But behind closed doors, investigators later learned that something much darker was unfolding. During the early 1990s, the group began targeting people Bunting accused of serious wrongdoing. In some cases, the accusations were based on rumors or suspicions rather than evidence. Yet within the group's isolated environment, those claims were treated as fact. This type of thinking can sometimes develop in tightly controlled social groups, particularly when a dominant personality reinforces the same beliefs repeatedly. Over time, members of the group may begin to see extreme actions as acceptable or even justified. For Bunting, the idea of punishing people he considered immoral became more than belief. It became a mission. As police dug deeper into the case, they discovered that many victims had financial resources tied to government assistance programs. After some victims disappeared, their identities were used to continue receiving welfare payments. This suggested that financial gain may have also played a role in the killings. In reality, the motives behind the crimes appeared to be a disturbing mixture of personal grudges, ideological hatred, and opportunistic greed. And while Bunting often portrayed himself as someone delivering justice, investigators would later conclude that many of the victims had little or nothing to do with the accusations made against them. Instead, they were simply people who happened to fall within the orbit of a dangerous and manipulative individual. For several years, the violence remained hidden. People disappeared quietly, their absences explained away or overlooked. Meanwhile, the group continued their lives, moving between houses in suburban Adelaide while maintaining the illusion that nothing unusual had occurred. But the chain of events that began with Bunting's influence would eventually lead to a series of crimes so disturbing that they shocked the entire nation. For the officers who made the discovery, the scene was deeply disturbing. Even seasoned investigators, people accustomed to difficult crime scenes, found the situation shocking. As forensic specialists worked through the evidence, they began the painstaking process of identifying the victims. This required careful analysis of skeletal remains, dental records, and missing persons reports. Meanwhile, detectives began retracing the chain of events that led the Barrels to Snowtown. What they discovered added another unsettling layer to the case. Most of the victims had not been killed in Snowtown at all. Instead, investigators traced the crimes back to various suburban locations around Adelaide. The town itself had been used primarily as a place to hide the bodies, far away from where the victims had originally lived. The barrels had been transported to the abandoned bank building and stored inside the vault, a location that provided both privacy and security. One of the suspects, Mark Haydon, had access to the building, which allowed the group to use the vault as a secret storage site. For years, the barrels sat undisturbed behind a thick vault door. The discovery triggered one of the largest murder investigations in South Australian history. Police assembled teams of detectives, forensic experts, and analysts to examine the growing body of evidence. Each victim had to be identified. Each disappearance had to be connected to the individuals responsible. The investigation quickly expanded beyond Snowtown itself. Officers began searching properties linked to the suspects, collecting forensic evidence, and interviewing anyone who might have had contact with the victims. What they uncovered painted an increasingly disturbing picture. This was not a single crime or even a pair of isolated murders. It was a prolonged series of killings carried out over nearly 7 years. The victims had been targeted, manipulated, and ultimately eliminated before being hidden inside the barrels that now sat inside the vault. News of the discovery spread quickly across Australia. Media outlets began reporting on what was soon referred to as the bodies in the barrels case. The shocking details captured national attention, leaving many people struggling to comprehend how such crimes could have remained hidden for so long. For the families of the victims, the discovery brought both heartbreak and painful answers. Some had spent years wondering what had happened to their loved ones. Now they faced the devastating reality that those disappearances were connected to a series of brutal killings. As the investigation intensified, police moved swiftly to arrest the men they believed were responsible. The case against them would soon lead to one of the most complex and widely followed trials in Australian criminal history. But before the legal proceedings could begin, detectives needed to build a complete picture of the crimes, piece by piece, victim by victim. And the evidence discovered inside those barrels would become the foundation of the prosecution's case. The quiet bank vault in Snowtown had finally revealed its terrible secret. As the case moved toward trial, it became clear that prosecutors were dealing with one of the most complex murder investigations in Australian history. The legal proceedings that followed would stretch over years. The court needed to examine extensive forensic evidence, testimony from witnesses, and the complicated relationships between the defendants. Investigators also had to reconstruct events that had occurred over nearly 7 years. James Vlassakis eventually became a key witness in the prosecution's case. Facing overwhelming evidence, he pleaded guilty to several of the murders and agreed to testify about the crimes committed by the group. His testimony helped prosecutors establish how the killings unfolded and how John Bunting had influenced the others. For the courtroom, the details were deeply disturbing. Evidence presented during the trial described the manipulation within the group, the targeting of vulnerable victims, and the financial exploitation that followed many of the disappearances. Jurors were forced to listen to testimony that revealed the full extent of what had taken place. The emotional weight of the trial affected everyone involved, families of the victims, investigators who had worked on the case, and even members of the jury tasked with hearing the evidence. When the verdicts were finally delivered, the court imposed some of the most severe sentences available under Australian law. John Bunting was convicted of 11 murders and received 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Robert Joe Wagner was convicted of 10 murders and was also sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. James Vlassakis, who had cooperated with authorities, received a life sentence with the possibility of parole after serving a minimum term. Mark Haydon was convicted for assisting in concealing the crimes and was sentenced to a lengthy prison term for helping dispose of the victims' bodies. The verdicts marked the legal conclusion of the case. But for many people, the emotional impact would last far longer. Families were left grieving loved ones whose lives had been taken in unimaginable circumstances. Communities struggled to understand how such crimes could occur in places that seemed ordinary and familiar. And the small town of Snowtown, which had once been almost unknown outside its region, would forever be associated with one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Australian history. Yet even after the trial ended, many questions continued to linger. How had such a series of crimes remained hidden for so long? How had one man managed to exert such influence over others that they would participate in acts of unimaginable cruelty? And what warning signs, if any, might have been overlooked along the way? The answers to those questions would continue to be debated long after the courtroom proceedings ended. Because the Snowtown murders were not only a story of violence, they were also a story about manipulation, vulnerability, and the terrifying consequences that can emerge when dangerous ideas are allowed to grow unchecked. And the legacy of those crimes would continue to shape the town, the families, and the national conversation for years to come. When the court proceedings finally came to an end, the legal chapter of the Snowtown murders had closed. The men responsible had been sentenced, the evidence had been laid out in detail, and the justice system had delivered its verdict. But for many people, the story did not end in the courtroom. For the families of the victims, the pain continued long after the headlines faded. Each victim had once been someone's child, sibling, or friend. They had lived ordinary lives filled with small routines and personal dreams. Some loved music. Some enjoyed simple gatherings with friends. Others were remembered for their quiet kindness or their willingness to help people even when they themselves had very little. Those lives had been abruptly taken away. For years, some families had searched desperately for answers, filing missing person reports and clinging to the hope that their loved ones might one day return. When the truth finally emerged, it brought clarity, but also a deep and lasting grief. Knowing what had happened did not erase the loss. The emotional weight of the case spread far beyond the victims' families. The small town of Snowtown itself became permanently linked to the crimes, even though the killings had largely occurred elsewhere. Residents of the quiet farming community suddenly found their town's name appearing in newspapers and television reports around the world. For many locals, it was a deeply uncomfortable transformation. Snowtown had always been known as a peaceful rural settlement, a place defined by farmland, grain silos, and close-knit neighbors. Now it had become synonymous with one of the most disturbing criminal cases in Australian history. Some residents worried that the town would never escape the stigma. At one point, discussions even emerged about whether the town's name should be changed in order to distance the community from the crimes. Ultimately, the name remained, but the association with the case has never fully disappeared. For law enforcement and criminal psychologists, the Snowtown murders also became a subject of intense study. Experts examining the case focus on the psychological dynamics that allowed the crimes to occur. One of the most troubling aspects was the way John Bunting had managed to influence the people around him. Psychologists often pointed to his ability to manipulate vulnerable individuals and reshape their thinking over time. Through repeated conversations, emotional pressure, and constant reinforcement of his beliefs, he created an environment where extreme actions could begin to feel justified. This type of manipulation can occur in certain social groups when a dominant personality gains control over others' perceptions of reality. Over time, followers may begin to adopt the leader's worldview without questioning it, especially if they feel isolated from outside influences. In the Snowtown case, that process appeared to unfold gradually. What may have begun as discussions about morality and wrongdoing slowly transformed into something far more dangerous. Accusations turned into hostility. Hostility turned into violence. The case also highlighted another disturbing reality. Many of the victims were people whose lives had already been marked by hardship. Because some were socially isolated or struggling with personal challenges, their disappearances did not immediately trigger large-scale investigations. That vulnerability made it easier for the perpetrators to operate undetected for years. For investigators and policymakers, the case became a reminder of how important it is to ensure that every missing person report is taken seriously, regardless of the individual's background or circumstances. Even decades later, the Snowtown murders continue to capture public attention. Books, documentaries, and films have attempted to examine the events and understand how such a tragedy could occur. For audiences, the story raises uncomfortable questions about human behavior. How does one person gain such influence over others? What psychological factors make individuals susceptible to manipulation? And perhaps most haunting of all, could warning signs have been recognized earlier? Some experts believe that subtle signals were present long before the crimes were discovered. Intense hostility towards certain groups, obsessive accusations without evidence, and an increasing pattern of isolation within the perpetrator's social circle. But in many communities, those warning signs can be difficult to interpret until it is too late. The Snowtown Murders ultimately stand as a tragic example of what can happen when manipulation, hatred, and vulnerability intersect. 12 lives were lost. Families were left grieving. A quiet town's name became permanently connected to a crime that shocked an entire nation. And yet, even with the conviction secured and the facts established, some questions still linger. Could earlier intervention have prevented some of the deaths? Were there missed opportunities to identify the pattern sooner? And how many other vulnerable people might still be at risk in similar circumstances today? Cases like this force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the darker aspects of society. They remind us that vigilance, compassion, and awareness are essential in protecting those who may not always have the strength or support to protect themselves. The Snowtown Murders are not only a STIY of crime. They are a story about the consequences of manipulation, the importance of recognizing vulnerability, and the enduring impact that violence leaves behind. But understanding these stories is also a way to learn from them. If you follow this case with us, what are your thoughts? Do you believe the warning signs could have been recognized earlier? What do you think allows individuals like John Bunting to gain such powerful influence over others? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments. Your perspective might spark an important discussion. And if you want to explore more true crime stories that examine the psychology, investigations, and real-life impact behind some of the world's most chilling cases, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss future episodes. Because every case tells a story. And sometimes, understanding those stories can help prevent future tragedies.